Welcome, everybody, to our March 2026 Conflict Resolution Colloquium. Very excited to have you all here. For those of you who don't know me, which I think most of you do, I'm Karen Ross. I'm the Director of Graduate Programs and Conflict Resolution. Very excited to welcome our speakers for tonight. Before I do, I'm just going to make a couple of very quick announcements. First of all, if you need colloquium credit for this event, please make sure that your full name is on the screen. So you change your Zoom settings so that we can see your full name. Second, for those of you who are getting close to graduation, woohoo! Graduation applications are due in a week from tomorrow on March 13th. If you are completing your program requirements and should be graduating in May, you should have received an email from the registrar with instructions. If you have any questions, please contact Kelly. Um, also, summer registration begins this week, and we will be offering, as we have for the past several years, conflict transformation across borders that Jeff will be sort of leading from the UMass Boston front, along with several others, including, I think, maybe both of our other guests tonight.
Yeah.
And I think Jeff will be holding a virtual information session about the Summer Institute on Wednesday, March 25th from 4 to 5 p.m. And that'll be a virtual session. So a Zoom link will be sent. Um, Also, those of you who are interested in applying for the David Matz Fellowship, the deadline is Friday, April 3rd, so you have a few weeks for that. And any student in the department, I think, who has completed 9 credits or more, is eligible to apply. Information I think, has been sent out about that as well. And finally, our next colloquium isn't until the end of April, but I want to encourage you all to put it on your calendars. On April 30th at 5:30, we will be hosting Ambassador Samantha Power for a fireside chat. The topic of this is our SLOMOF event, this year entitled International Development in an Era of Change. We are very excited about it and hope to see you all there. So please put it on your calendars, and I will put the flyer in the chat actually, so you all have it. Um, and with that, I'm also very pleased to welcome here tonight, of course, our own Professor Jeff Pugh, along with his colleagues, Cécile Mouly and Josefina Echavarría, who will be speaking about crossing borders in search of the truth, the work of the Colombian Truth Commission with Exiles. And this is based on, I think, the co-edited book that the three of them have been working on. So just a quick introduction of our guests. Dr. Cécile Mouly is the coordinator of the Peace and Conflict Lab at Flasco, Ecuador. She has published on peace building, peace processes, transitional justice, civil resistance, and the reintegration of former combatants. She was part of the Ecuador team of the Colombian Truth Commission from 2019 to 2022 and is now involved in efforts to support its legacy. And she is also part of the Virtual Summer Institute. Um, Along with her, Dr. Josefina Echavarría Alvarez is the director of the Peace Accords Matrix program at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. She also directs the Legacy Project for preserving and engaging the digital archive of the Colombian Truth Commission. And Dr. Echeverria, I am not sure, but I think you might also be involved in the Virtual Summer Institute, Conflict
Often
Transformation.
as a
I
guest
see.
speaker, yes.
Yes, okay.
I guess
So
when they
what?
invite me.
Excellent. So both of them with our own Dr. Jeffrey Pugh, who is the co-director of the Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development in here at UMass Boston in the McCormick School. He previously founded and directed the Center for Mediation, Peace, and the Resolution of Conflict, CEMPROC, based in Quito, Ecuador. He has served as a volunteer interviewer in the U.S. node of the Colombian Truth Commission Support Network, and of course, you all know him as one of our faculty members here in the Conflict Resolution Program. So with that, I will turn it over to the three of you. I'm very excited to hear about this work that you have been doing and learn more about it.
Thanks so much, Karen. And thanks all of you for joining us here online. I know quite a few of the folks here are from our community, but some who are Columbia watchers coming from other places. Welcome to you all as well. This is really the first public event that we're doing as sort of a book talk. We had kind of hoped we would have the book in hand to show by this point, but publication sometimes takes a little longer. But we do want to share the the overview of both the Colombian Truth Commission's work with exiles outside of Colombia, because that's such an innovative model. We'll talk more about that, that hasn't been done before. And specifically this book, which I guess I'll just put a little bit of a note at the front, is sort of an insider account to some extent. Karen just alluded to the fact all of us have been involved along the way. Josefina's group actually before, because the Peace Accords Matrix and Notre Dame are written into the peace agreement. How often can a university say that? To monitor the implementation of the peace agreement, including the transitional justice pieces. And then Cecile and I were both part of this network, and we've accumulated in this book a lot of the other people who are involved in nodes around the world and who have written, including Commissioner Beristain, who was the one in charge of exile. So we're hoping that through documenting this innovative process, we are doing something that will be of value to other processes. So I'm going to share the screen now, and that means I can no longer see anybody else. So I guess if somebody needs to get my attention, just like shout it out or something. To preview, um, uh, this is an edited volume of 16 chapters, and it examines the work of the Colombian Truth Commission outside of the country. More than 20 countries outside of Colombia made up this global network of support in gathering the testimonies of people who had fled into exile. The Colombian Truth Commission itself was created as a result of the 2016 peace agreement, and it had a mandate of 3.5 years. It was extended slightly because of the pandemic. And now it has an ongoing strategy to sustain its legacy even after the Truth Commission finished its mandate and disbanded. As I just mentioned, it was groundbreaking in for the first time systematically including the voices and testimonies of exiled Colombians in its work. So previous models would talk about exiles and refugees and victims abroad. One, Liberia, even did collect some testimonies, but on a pretty small scale. So this was the first time that was done systematically. And that work was crucial in documenting and recognizing exile as a major violation of human rights and the second most widespread violation in the context of the armed conflict. So it really, exile is its own chapter of the Truth Commission's final report. So this was quite an undertaking. To give you a sense of where we're going today, Josefina will give some background on the Colombian Peace Process and Truth Commission, for those who may not be as familiar with this case, talk about the mandate and networking structure of the Truth Commission abroad. We'll talk about the book's contribution to academic discussions and the literature on transitional justice briefly. One of the things that's exciting about this work is it's not just academic outputs. With Cecile and the node, or they commissioned a documentary film on the work of the Colombian Truth Commission in Ecuador. And so we'll show just a brief clip from that, the trailer called Solo la Verdad. And that film has been screened already. It had its launch in Ecuador recently and plans to have additional screenings in other countries. And so that will give you a little bit of a sense of what some of this work looked like and the voices of some of the exiles. We'll give an overview of just what's in the book, some of the kinds of chapters, so you can see the range of topics, interdisciplinary approaches, and regional representation that are here. Uh, we'll talk about kind of the lessons learned. What do we learn as a result of all this collection of knowledge that's here? What are the takeaways and findings, including some that are fairly practical recommendations for policymakers or other truth commissions that may realize they're in a situation with a lot of exiles, refugees. I'm thinking here of cases like Syria that is about to go through some form of transitional justice and may learn some from this case. And then we'll wrap up with some final thoughts at the end. So I want to turn it now to Josefina to go through this part, and Josefina, just tell me when to advance.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So first, thank you so much to the university for hosting us today. Cecile and myself, we're very glad to be here with all of you. As Jeff was saying, so many of you that have familiar faces and names, we're very happy to see you again. And for those of you that I haven't had the opportunity to meet, well, it's really a pleasure. I wanted to share perhaps the background of the Colombian Truth Commission, which is also part of the background to this book, because I believe that questions like, for example, the legacy archives, what Jeff was saying before, the follow-up monitoring verification of the implementation of the recommendations, those are features of the Truth Commission that really make sense because the Truth Commission was part of a much larger peace process, which is part of the peace agreement that was signed in 2016. Part of what makes this Truth Commission so groundbreaking, as Jeff was saying, is also because it's part of a much more comprehensive system of transitional justice. So very often when we look at other truth commissions around the world, what we see is that they have been established in moments of transition, perhaps from democracies to dictatorships. Some are, of course, part of peace agreements, but there are many others that have been created and have a mandate specifically because there is a government authority, it can be the president or the Congress, that creates the Truth Commission. And I believe that the contributions of those commissions to larger processes of peace building are much more limited. So what we wanted was to first place the Colombian Truth Commission within this larger framework that allows us also to perhaps shed some light on the ambition of the scope and, of course, the reach of the Truth Commission, including the chapter of exile. When we look at the peace negotiations that were held in Havana, Cuba between 2012 and 2016, what we find is, of course, the Colombian government. At that time, the president was Juan Manuel Santos, who is now the chair of the elders. And on the other hand, very classical Marxist-Leninist inspired guerrilla from Latin America, the FARC-EP, originally founded already in the 60s and very much created as a very strong political opposition, armed struggle party then in Colombia since 1974. And so during that negotiation table, there were a certain number of rules. You call it perhaps in peace studies, when we think about the design of peace accords, there were some given frameworks that were very important to understand perhaps some of the keys to the success of this particular negotiation. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, so there will be no consecutive implementation of agreements. We learned that from the Good Friday Agreement, ratified by the population, very controversial aspect of it. But the idea was that top-down and elite-driven pacts were not sustainable and didn't have any ownership. Victims were to be at the center. And what we wanted to highlight together with victims at the center was the participation of civil society. Click, Jeff, now. Thank you. And so what we find is that the legacy of the Commission and the ownership of the work of the Commission, both in Colombia and abroad, has been really thanks in great part because of the participation of civil society during the negotiations. We have formal and informal consultations that we have seen in many other places around the world, where you see some of the women that this is the subcommittee on gender. What we have is an incredible network of mostly women, but also civil society organizations and transitional justice institutions that contribute to the design of the peace process in Colombia, specifically the transitional justice framework. And in that way, Colombia benefits from a lot of lessons learned from other peace agreements implementation, specifically not just Chapter 5 of the Accord, but also the question of demobilization. So issues such as the UN verification missions, the disarmament of combatants, the cantonment of combatants. We have, as part of this negotiation structure, also the importance of bringing in civil society, not just in the Colombian territories, to Havana itself, but also online. A lot of these civil society organizations forum were organized by the United Nations together with the Universidad Nacional in Colombia. And what we see is really an incredible effort, at least in the negotiation phase, to bring in civil society. Next, Jeff. Thank you. One example of that, this has been written a lot about in peace studies. Roddy Brett, for example, has a wonderful book about this, which was the impact when we look at civil society, for example, of the victims and the victims delegations in the design of the Colombian Peace Accord. A lot of the same interactions is what we see replicated, of course, in the implementation of the mandate of the Truth Commission, both in Colombia and in exile. But the idea was that victims, there were 60 victims, 15 groups, 15 people in 4 groups that were chosen, trying to look for a very diverse group of people that had suffered from different types of armed actors and victims of different types of crime, go to Havana and are given, in theory, 15 minutes. But I think that if you read the accounts of these interactions, none of them was really interrupted to share their testimonies and their proposals. And I think it's important because what we are going to see that is really part of the strength of the work of exile of the Colombian Truth Commission is relying on those networks that many of which pre-existed the commission and were precisely activated also, not just during the 90s of previous peace processes, but specifically during the negotiations. Thank you, Jeff. This is a table that summarizes, just as an example, which were the proposals from the victims delegations that were brought to Havana. Almost all of them were integrated in different provisions or commitments in the peace accord. A commission for the search for the disappeared. We have it, of course, in the form of the unit for the search for the disappeared. The establishment of a truth commission was a very clear demand from victims organizations. Perhaps of all of these, the only one that was not really incorporated was a comprehensive agrarian reform. The proposal from the victims delegations was much more ambitious than the rural integral reform that we have in the final accord. This is one of our distribution charts, the ones that we produce as part of our barometer initiative, following up the implementation of the Colombian Accord. I wanted to share this with you because while, of course, victims and civil society organizations participated with a lot of enthusiasm in shaping the design of Chapter 5, which deals with truth and reconciliation and the system of justice, they were able to negotiate specific stipulations and provisions for victims throughout the accord. And what we see both in the mandate of the Truth Commission and in the implementation of the mandate is, for example, that very strong presence of ethnic communities from the methodology to the pedagogy, the idea of extraterritoriality, and of course of the acknowledgement and the recognition of victims to be at the center of the effort of the peace accord. This greatly also explains the same design of Chapter 5. If we move to the next one, Jeff, the following one, in which we find that the Truth Commission is only one. No, you can leave the three.
Oh, you did want to.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, sir. That the Truth Commission is one of three main mechanisms of transitional justice in the Colombian Peace Accord. We have an extrajudicial truth that was the task of the Colombian Truth Commission, 3 years, as Jeff said, extended because of COVID, because victims demanded the extension of the mandate of the Truth Commission. Congress listens and agrees to it. Then we have a system that it's very well known nowadays because of the sentences that just started being issued in September last year, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, that is the one that actually judges those most responsible for the crimes. And as we heard from the victims' proposals, a unit for the search for the disappeared. This has a humanitarian character and with the intention then that those most responsible, but that a lot of the research that has been done, for example, through the Truth Commission, do not lead to prosecution, but they lead to contribute to the search for the missing. So it is within this framework that we find the Colombian Truth Commission, and I think that Cecile is going to share more with you about the mandate and its working. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Josefina. So now let's turn to the Truth Commission itself. And the Truth Commission had had a mandate made up of 4 pillars. One of them was truth seeking, clarifying the truth about the massive and systematic human rights violation committed during the armed conflict. Another pillar was the recognition both of damage done to victims, but also of responsibilities by different kind of actors from different sides of the conflict, and including so-called third parties that are called in Spanish terceros civiles, people who are not officially parties in the conflict, but who also had some responsibility in human rights violation. And then there were 2 additional pillars that were contributing to peaceful coexistence and promoting better relation between sectors divided by the armed conflict and fostering non-repetition. In the work of the Truth Commission with Exile, we will see that we worked above all on the 2 first pillars. So let's move to the next one. So the Truth Commission, in order to do its work abroad, relied on a network structure and worked in 24 countries officially. With Jeff, we found that there were a few additional countries where the Commission actually worked, but in its final report, the Commission just mentioned these 24 countries. And in order to work in these 24 countries, it established a network of actors and teams in 21 countries. So there were 3 countries in which the Commission worked where there was no actually local team, although there were people in these countries that, the Truth Commission worked with. So they were not in these 21 countries, and sometimes these nodes covered the whole country, and sometimes they just covered a region of it, or sometimes they even cover just a city. Through this network structure, the Commission was able to collect over 2,000 testimonies of exile. This network, really, what's important about it is that it was made up essentially of volunteers. The Truth Commission didn't have funds that that it was able to spend to pay like staff abroad. Although there were some limited funds that enabled the Truth Commission to hire 5 liaison officers in strategic places, but the rest of it were volunteers. This said, there were some international organizations or NGO or actors that sometimes had some staff that actually helped the work, and these were paid by their own organization. So let's move to the map now to see the coverage of this network structure. As you can see, it mainly covered countries both in Europe and in the Americas. And where you see the countries in blue are countries where there was more than one node. For example, in Canada, there were 3 nodes because of the side of the country. So there was one that covered British Columbia and Alberta, one that covered Ontario, and one that covered Quebec. And in the US, there were several nodes as well. Jeff, for example, was part of the node New York, Washington, D.C., and was it Washington?
New York, New Jersey, and Boston.
No,
Washington,
sorry,
D.C.
yeah,
was a separate node.
Washington, D.C. was with Philadelphia. I'm sorry. Yeah, when I said Washington, I said that was wrong. Yeah, you're right. And then the places that are kind of yellowish are places where there was some work, like in Peru, the Netherlands, and Australia, but there was no team actually as a node there. And the other one, like for example, Ecuador, where I'm based, they had only one node covering the whole country. So let's move to the next one, Jeff.
So we're hoping that in addition to being an empirical contribution, because this is an innovative case, we're just documenting what happened and sort of figuring out how it worked, why it worked. We also think it contributes theoretically to our understanding of transitional justice. It brings together work on transitional justice with work on migration studies and exile. And those have tended to be fairly separate because in the past, most of the time, transitional justice might include a focus about people in exile, but not usually include them as actors with agency to negotiate as part of the process. Because it's an innovative model, it breaks new theoretical ground as well. And we're looking at sort of transnational networked transitional justice. We're still working on a shorter, catchier phrase to capture what that means, but that's a lot of the kind of theoretical focus here. And I'll talk also about agonistic approaches to transitional justice. There's some pressure to have a nice, neat, unifying narrative that everyone kind of signs onto, but that often results in silencing certain voices. And so we'll talk about Colombia's willingness to have a messy process in which sometimes it wasn't one nice, neat narrative, but instead allowed for multiple truths. So we'll talk a little bit about that. In transitional justice, as I mentioned, exiles are really kind of forgotten actors. The narratives are about them, but don't include their voices usually. And only a few studies analyze their participation directly in transitional justice mechanisms like truth commissions. A lot of those have been about the Liberia case that I mentioned before, although there's a few others where some small part of it did incorporate this focus. So analyzing the Truth Commission's work outside of Colombia really contributes to this literature that is fairly scarce on exiles' role as important co-equal sort of voices within this transitional justice process. And I just want to give a little note here. You've heard the word victim early on when we were talking about the way it was framed in the peace process and otherwise. But in this latter half, you hear a lot about exile, and that's very intentional. One of the things that these victim groups said when they came to Havana and others continued their advocacy was they felt like the word victim didn't resonate as much with them. They felt it was denying their agency. It was sort of painting them as passive recipients of harm. And they certainly had experienced harm, but also not really recognizing that they had a role in deciding how it would be repaired and fixed. And so exile kept the political agency that was important to them. So that was an intentional use, a decision to use that term throughout the Truth Commission's work abroad. And Carlos Beristain has talked about the process of making that decision. So, the analyses that we have here demonstrate the power of exiles in shaping truth-seeking processes. I mentioned before this agonistic approach to transitional justice. The commission didn't try to say, here's what our new narrative of a healed country looks like, and everyone just get in line. Instead, they embraced multiple exile narratives because you had different kinds of victims. People were victimized by the FARC, people were victimized by the state itself, by the paramilitaries, by others. And often there's a bit of tension among those different groups, and they had quite different versions of how they saw the conflict. And the Truth Commission actively tried to reach out, get those stories from everybody who had been victimized, and bring it together in a way that led to a maybe more holistic but also pluralistic truth. Testimonies were contrasted rather than just try and meld it into one version. And then digital archives, artistic expressions, music, storytelling, these enhanced public engagement and allowed different kinds of understanding to come through. There are certain types of pain, of emotion, of people's experience that you really can't even express in words. And so the Truth Commission tried to use multiple forms of public events, artistic exhibitions, a permanent digital archive that now Josefina has been helping with, all of these things to allow a pluralistic way of expressing these multiple truths. So that's an important thing to mention as well. And now, Cécile, do you want to briefly describe about the documentary, and then I can play the clip?
Yeah, I will say something really very brief, and I'd rather like you to ask questions in the Q&A about it. But this documentary is a result of the recognition process. You remember I mentioned that the mandate of the Truth Commission had 4 pillars. And so one of these pillars was the recognition. And in particular, what we worked outside of Colombia, we worked on the recognition of exile. And at the end of 2021, we did a survey in Ecuador about what exiled people, Colombian exiled people, wanted to be recognized and how they wanted it to be recognized. And we actually systematically, recorded their responses. And I think the number one response about how was through a documentary. People really wanted that others knew about their experience through a documentary. So it took us a little bit of time to actually succeed in getting this documentary because, as you may know, documentaries are quite expensive, and we really worked all on a voluntary basis, and it was really difficult to find the funds. But fortunately, Humanity United helped us, and we were able to achieve this I would say this was even like a dream for many exiles here. So we are all very happy of this achievement, and we hope that it will be able to be broadcast in different places. It will also have in the future subtitles, like the whole documentary in English, but at the moment it's only in Spanish. But it should actually be broadcast in New Jersey fairly soon, but in Spanish. So, Jeff, you want to show the little trailer?
Yes.
Siempre hemos sido discriminados y hemos sido muy olvidados. Si dicen algo, con mucho respeto digo estas palabras, lo tratan de callar para que no hable, y por lo tanto mejor se aplica esa palabra que decíamos de muchacho, la voz del silencio, para preservar la vida y que de pronto por abrir la boca no nos vayan a callar totalmente.
Salirnos del país de uno y llegar a otro no es nada fácil, es bastante difícil.
Es una mezcla de sentimientos, de dolor, de tristeza, de todo un poco, ¿sí? De impotencia.
Porque mi vida sin ti no me vale nada.
En un país donde sus costumbres son totalmente diferentes, donde ellos mismos no entienden el concepto de la guerra, donde nosotros somos mal vistos.
Es duro dejar la tierra y sentir que el derecho a la vida es un derecho en el papel.
Cuando yo tenía como unos 9 o 10 años, por primera vez yo vi la guerrilla.
Como nos atacaba el ejército por aire y tierra, ellos bombardeaban todo alrededor que encontraran, no importando que murieran todos los campesinos que hubieran. Para ellos era felicidad porque todos los hacían pasar como que si fueran terroristas.
En Colombia el exilio no existe. Todos los refugiados que yo he conocido, que he entrevistado, al exiliarse a otros países han perdido estatus, han perdido trabajo, tienen pérdidas materiales.
Mira pa'l sur, tierra mía, ya es el amanecer, mira pa'l sur.
Yo también soy víctima del conflicto armado y después de escuchar los testimonios, créanme que no tengo otra palabra para decirles. Como ciudadano colombiano, como ciudadano del mundo, perdónennos.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So I hope that this will make you want to see the full documentary, and hope that Jeff will be able to show it at UMass Boston once we have the English subtitles, because at the moment it's only in Spanish. So let's move to the next one. Quickly, I want to give you a brief overview of the book. As we said at the beginning, this is a book made up of 16 chapters, mainly written by people who have participated directly in the work of the Truth Commission abroad, including some of the authors are exiles themselves. We also have a chapter by the commissioner that you could see actually in this trailer, Commissioner Martin Beristain, who's from Spain, the only foreigner among the 11 commissioners. And some of the chapters talk about certain themes, and others are actually case studies of the work of the Truth Commission abroad. In particular, we have a chapter on, you will see, on Germany and Venezuela, on Ecuador, on the UK, on Canada. And also, there were, we didn't mention that in the beginning, but in addition to the notes that were the teams of the Truth Commission in the different countries, regions, even cities, like in Spain, we had a note, for example, for Madrid, for the capital city. There were also internodal groups, and one of the most active one was the internodal group of gender. And these internodal groups, they were in charge of cross-cutting issues like gender, that cut across actually different territories. And Jeff will tell you a little bit more about the very important role of these cross-cutting issues in the last part about lessons learned. But there is actually a chapter on the internodal group of gender, and 2 chapters that also talk about gender. So I'd like to go directly to the, if we can go, to the table of contents because of time. So very briefly, the first chapters, as you will see, they are a little bit more general. And in particular, the third one looks at what came before, actually, the work of the Truth Commission with Exile. There was a previous work that is really important to take into account that made it possible, actually, for the whole transitional justice system to take into account so-called victims outside of the countries. And this was because of the activisms of some people. And actually, there was one representative of Exile that participated in the victims delegation that Josefina mentioned. And through, this kind of activism, they were able to ensure that they would have a voice in transitional justice and being taken into account. So we have that chapter. We also have a very important chapter by the commissioner who was in charge of the work of the Truth Commission abroad, Carlos Martin Beristain, on recognition, and actually on different types of recognition. But he focuses not in this chapter, it talks about different kinds of recognition, but with regard to exile, not with regard to responsibility, which was also part of the mandate of the Truth Commission, that, actors that were responsible of human rights violation also recognized their responsibility. But here, the focus is really on the recognition of exile, but different forms of recognition. And I think it's a fantastic chapter. I really highly recommend it. And there is another chapter actually on recognition that we will see on the next slide by Catherine Salamanca. But before that, I want to mention also our chapter with Jeff. And actually, it should be Jeff first because he was the first author. I didn't realize, but in our slide, we have my name first. But Jeff led actually this chapter. And in this chapter, we really focus on the network structure that made it possible for the Truth Commission to work outside of the countries in, as we said, over 20 countries. Let's go to the next one. I already mentioned that Catherine Salamanca wrote on the recognition as well. We also have a chapter by Carolina Morales and Maria Margarita Echeverry. Both of them are psychologists, and they accompanied the work of the team of the so-called international macro territory that was in charge of this work outside Colombia. And they worked in particular with Ecuador and Chile. So in this chapter, the two of them really looked at the impressive work that this team at headquarters actually had, and how much they achieved working, as you see in the title, working 32 hours per day, that was like really the way it felt, for them working, having such a short time to achieve so much and work with so many exiles in so many different countries. Then we have a chapter on the so-called exiled archives by three authors, two of whom worked from Switzerland and were involved in the Swiss node. Then we have a chapter by one person who worked from the Basque Country node on the so-called no place in exile. This chapter also talks quite a lot about gender and about women's role in the Truth Commission. Let's go to the next slide. Then we have two other chapters that also work on gender. As I said, one very specifically on this internodal group on gender, and one that talks more from an intersectional point of view and including the legacy of the Truth Commission after it completed its mandate. Then we have a chapter by two people who actually worked for the technical secretariat for the Truth Commission in Europe. That was ESIP. ESIP is an organization, an academic organization that actually is, it's a little bit like USIP, well, it was like USIP, but for the Catalan government in Spain, like that kind of, as we say, a status. So ESIP was actually played the role of technical secretariat for the Truth Commission in Europe and was organizing all the meetings of the European-based nodes. So we have a chapter about that role. And then we have our first chapter on case studies, the chapter by Indira and Stefan, that is on both the experience in Germany and Venezuela. Then next one, we have a chapter, next slide, on the work in Ecuador, focusing specifically on the taking of testimonies and what it meant to listen to exiles. Then we have a chapter on the work in the UK and particularly on the use of art. We already talked a little bit about art and we'll go back to it in the lessons learned. Another chapter that also looks pretty much about the importance of art, but in that case about singing, which is the work, which talk about the work of the Quebec node in Canada and how they worked really along a choir to do all their work there. And then we have the concluding chapter by all of us. So let's move quickly to the next one, Jeff. So now let's move to our main research findings and then lessons learned, and then we'll open up for questions. So among the first important research findings, we saw that there was a continuum. It was not, the Truth Commission arrived and suddenly people in exile started exerting their agency and participating in the process, but there was a continuum. There was a before, and this is like particularly well explained in the chapter by Jason Martinez, where the exiles started organizing themselves and putting pressure already from the time of the peace negotiations to be part of this process. Obviously, when the Truth Commission was established, that opened a window of opportunities for them that they immediately seized, and they became like key actors of the process. And now that the Truth Commission has finished its mandate, it's not that, all of a sudden all of this, disappeared. These people continue to be working and in particular being involved in what we call so-called legacy activities, such as promoting the implementation of the Truth Commission recommendation, disseminating the content of the final report of the Truth Commission, and a lot trying to foster the recognition of exile in different contexts. So this is like really one of the first points. The second point is that this process really would not have been possible without the agency of exiles themselves. Even though this work of the Truth Commission abroad didn't rely only on exiles, it also relied on other actors, like, for example, Jeff and myself, who were part of the academia, or Josefina. Exiles were key in making this process work. And they were key not only because they gave their testimony as part of the process, but also because they led it, they participated in it, and they participated in it in many different ways. Some of them, for example, investigated certain human rights abuses and produced reports that they submitted to the Truth Commission. Some of them organized events. Some of them took testimonies themselves. Not only did they give them their testimony, they also took testimonies. They organized artistic initiatives, for example, groups of women writing about their experiences. So all of this. So let's go to the next slide, Jeff. What's also very important to note is that as part of this process of exerting their agency, exile became more and more empowered and came to really own the process, which is really important because it has ensured in some way its sustainability. The fact that people continue to be working on pressing, for example, for the implementation of the recommendations, disseminating the content of the report, etc., would not have been possible if people didn't own the process. And at the moment, we have so-called groups in support of the Truth Commission legacy in many of these 24 countries that we mentioned and that you could see on the map. And what's very important as well is that when the Truth Commission finished its mandate, a committee that is called Committee on Follow-up and Monitoring of the Implementation of the Colombian Truth Commission's recommendation, in short, CSM, was established. And this committee is made up of 7 members, and one of them actually represents exile. And as you can see, it is kind of a victory for exiles to have 1 out of 7 members representing different sectors of society, of people who have been victims. One of them is a person representing exile. Her name is Doris Ardila. She's actually based in Spain.
And she's one of our contributing authors.
And is one of our contributing authors, as Jeff said. And then the last point that I think is really important is that this experience of the Truth Commission has had an influence on other processes, and not only transitional justice processes, but also but also peace building and peace processes in general. So, for example, after the experience of the Truth Commission work with exile, the peace process with the ELN guerrilla that started during the Petro government had established some spaces for the participation of civil society, and they organized these spaces among different sectors. And among the 80 plus sectors that they defined, one of them is actually the diaspora. They call it diaspora, but it includes mainly exiles. And so this process is now stalled, but in the first phase of the participation of civil society, exiles actually were able to participate, and there were specific spaces for their participation. And that is really a result and an influence, direct influence from the work of the Truth Commission with exiles. Let's move to the lessons learned now. So first first lessons learned, the importance of the inclusion and participation of exiles. As Jeff said before, there have been experiences with other Truth Commission of inclusion of exile, but it's really the first experience of a transitional justice mechanism that actively involves the exiled population, not only as providers of testimonies, but as the taker of testimonies, as organizers of activities and so on. And that's really important, as we said, for the sustainability of the process, for the ownership of the process, for the sustainability, but it's also important in other regards. In particular, the involvement of exiles can contribute to the clarification of truth about human rights violation committed in their country of origin. Sometimes there are very few people left in the country that really know about a specific type of event that occurred in the country, and the truth has actually left the country. And that was particularly the case, for example, about the Patriotic Union massacres. A lot of information about it was actually outside the country. So having access, for example, to these so-called exiled archives really contributed to clarifying the truth about human rights violations that were committed in Colombia. But obviously, it's also very important to understand the phenomenon of exile itself. Exile was recognized as the second most common type of human rights violation committed during the armed conflict by the Truth Commission. So it's a very significant phenomenon. Over 1 million Colombians had to flee their countries. So it was really important to know more and understand better that phenomenon. And also, exiles are the best place to be able to recommend what can be done to prevent it, for non-repetition. Another important thing to bear in mind is that the involvement of exiles themselves contributes to the recognition of exile in various dimensions. We have it in particular in, as I said, Carlos Beristain and Catherine Salamanca's chapters. They really talk about how having them participate in the process really enable the recognition of multiple forms of suffering endured by exiles, such as discrimination, such as a lack of belief in their stories, a loss of the socioeconomic status, as you could see, for example, in the trailer. The trailer, actually, that part, when Carlos Beristain talks about this, it's actually part of one of the recognition events that was organized by the Truth Commission about exile. There were 2 recognition events organized by the Truth Commission outside of the country. One that was a worldwide recognition event that was online because of the pandemic, and another one that was in person that took place in Ecuador, and that specifically focused on exile in neighboring countries from Colombia, because obviously the situation is not the same for exiles who could take a flight and go to Europe, and exiles who had to leave by foot and cross the border and very often arrive in very, very dire condition to Ecuador or Venezuela or Panama, for example. So the participation of exiles was really key to reveal this, and in particular for the Colombian society to realize this, what it meant to have gone into exile, and actually to confront the widespread belief that very often the people who had left the country were actually in a better position, that the so-called golden exile phenomenon. So it was really important for their participation to show that and to reveal this, especially for the Colombian society to better understand this, but also in the host countries. Then let's go to the next one, Jeff, about trust. So the participation of exiles in transitional justice requires forging alliances with different actors in order to make it possible. It's important to build, we realize that it's important to actually take into account pre-existing networks, and that the network actually that enabled the Truth Commission to be able to do all its work really relied on these pre-existing networks in the different countries, in particular on a network of victims organizations such as Revit Paslac and the Foro Internacional de Víctima, but it was also important to include other types of actors, such as academics, such as peace and human rights NGOs, such as local governments, psychologists, etc., because all of them actually could complement each other and play different roles and bring different resources that enable this work to be able to take place. In particular, for example, academia brought some spaces to organize events. Local NGOs very often brought resources to be able to organize activities. Psychologists brought psychosocial support. Through artists, there could be a lot of artistic activities and so on. So this was key in particular because the Truth Commission could not rely on state funds, on the budget, to be able to fund the work outside Colombia. And it needed also human resources to be able to do this work. And obviously, they couldn't rely on consulates and embassies, because consulates and embassies were seen as sided with the government, and very often exiles didn't trust them. So they really needed to use other types of human resources and have access to different types of fundings to be able to do their work. And they could do this through this really big network. Then final thing I think that is important is that having access to or involving all these actors also helped work with different types of exile, different groups of exiled people. Very often in exile, people, for example, who are victims of the guerrilla don't speak with people who are victims of the government or the paramilitaries. So in order to be able to work with all these different groups, it was very important to have actors actually that could bridge over these divides and act sometimes even as mediators to enable like a greater inclusion and address conflict that could arise. And also these networks were really important, as I mentioned before, to sustain the process in the long run. So let's continue, Jeff.
Okay, so being aware of wanting to leave some time for questions, I'm gonna hit the highlights of these last few lessons learned in a fairly abbreviated form. But in terms of what we learn about how to seek the truth, the Colombian Truth Commission showed that it's really important to have different interviewer profiles. So exiled people often knew the communities, could get access to the communities, but as Cecile just said, the ones that trusted them, and there were others that were not trusted by them. And so it helped to have multiple groups represented within the nodes. Academics could sometimes be the outsiders that were trusted more or had specific skills. So this was an important piece to have a diverse set of talents within the nodes. And, just the practicalities of making sure that you have some recognition or compensation for their time, but that it's equitable and that it doesn't create such incentives that people are in it just for the money. Those are some of the kinds of things that were learned. Cecile mentioned earlier the internodal groups, and certainly the gender one that we've talked about was really important, and that came as sort of a demand pushed thing. It came out of a summit that a bunch of women said, we need this space that can cut across territories to really center the experience of women and also the way that gender intersected with conflict. But there were also cross-cutting internodal groups on psychosocial support and others. So that was important to have that. Art and creativity was a really important methodology in a lot of the nodes and in the internodal groups. It could go beyond a report that would sit on someone's desk and maybe only reach technocrats. It really was a method for reaching people in a way that touched them and that they could resonate with. Sometimes it crossed language barriers in terms of host communities and allowed for a deeper connection with emotion and trauma. And so not seeing this as peripheral, but seeing this as a centered way to do transitional justice, I think we see lots of examples from the Colombian case where we see the impact of it. And we've shared this in several different ways throughout this presentation, but advocacy, not only as something people on the outside do towards the authority figures, but an ongoing negotiation between Colombians in Colombia, Colombians outside of Colombia, the societies in both places, the host society and Colombian society overall, the institutions, the state, both the Colombian state and the host state, and then international organizations. There were lots of directions in which advocacy could run, and that was important for generating funds. So most of the money that was spent outside of the country, this kind of advocacy generated it from the UN system, from UNDP, from IOM, as well as USAID and other places. And so that helped to not only make it possible to have this be a centerpiece of the Truth Commission, but also to make sure that it was sustainable, right? The follow through monitoring committee came also through these advocacy strategies. So to kind of wrap this up, we understand here that the search for truth requires crossing many types of borders. Geographic ones, this was a transnational process that coordinated across geographic borders where people lived, but also identity borders, political borders. Sometimes Colombians in the same city wouldn't talk to each other or trust each other, but by participating together in a node, they realized how much they had in common and were able to reframe their identity as, I helped to heal my country. And, so did this neighbor that I didn't trust before, but I see they care about the country too. And so it really had a catalytic role in kind of reshaping identities in some cases. It was interdisciplinary. It brought in all sorts of actors from civil society, academics, and the state. And I think it serves as a model for future processes in a way that I hope we'll all learn from. So if you're interested in learning more about this or just to follow this project as it goes forward, as we mentioned at the beginning, the book is forthcoming from Editorial Universidad del Externado. I hope at some point we'll have an English translation as well. But there's a QR code. Feel free to scan it, and that'll take you to our project page. And there you can see a lot of the work that's been happening along the way. Some articles by our team, by others who are following this process about the role of the Colombian Truth Commission's work in exile. And hopefully that will be helpful. And just as a plug for those of you who are students or who are interested in learning, our Summer Institute on Conflict Transformation Across Borders is a 2-week course, virtual course that'll happen in June. Cécile and I have been leading this for a while, and we have a wonderful lineup, hopefully including Josefina and her team and others, that helps to look at conflict in lots of ways from borders and brings together fantastic guest speakers. So do think about that if you're interested in these topics. So we'll leave it there and open for a few questions. And I think maybe the best way to do that is to just let you put up your Zoom hand if anybody has questions that you'd like to engage on. Karen, break our ice.
I will think so. That was absolutely fascinating. And yeah, I'm really both excited to read this and will be patient for an English translation. But I was actually so all the part about the transnational nature of this and the nodes and everything are really fascinating. But Jeff, there's one thing that you said that you were talking about how the commission was not trying to sort of formulate a single truth, new narrative. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about, um, sort of what that looked like, how it was received. I guess I'll leave it at that, so that you have time to answer other questions too.
Yeah. I could take a crack, but Josefina, do you want to lead off on that?
And why don't we take like a couple of questions because
That's probably a good idea. Maybe collect
yeah, I think
two
we
or
can manage
three, and
better the
we'll
time.
respond
Yeah.
to all of them. Aiki, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. That was really interesting, and the work seems very important. Um, I was wondering just about replicability. Do you think that this is something that could be done elsewhere in Latin America? There are like not a few amount of countries that like number of countries that have gone through dictatorships with exiles and other similar situations.
Great. Well, let's take those two that. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Maka. We'll collect three and then respond to those three and then see if we have time for another round.
Thank you very much. It was like really interesting. I have two questions, if I may have. So one is that you mentioned that when you were talking to the participants, they kind of resisted to be um, seen as only victims, but they wanted to have the agency. So what do you think? What was the most powerful mechanisms or measures which I mean, that shift, they wanted, like that shift happened, like shift from being victim from having an agency. And then my another question is that like you were talking about narratives, and then my dissertation is very much about disinformation. Did you have any uh, experience or sort of did you encounter that disinformation had a role? Um, and then what was the role? I mean, if you had any kind of experience related to disinformation. Thank you.
Okay. Um, Josefina, do you want to take the pluralistic, agonistic question, and then
Yes.
I can talk about replicability, maybe?
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. Thank you so much for your question, Karen. I think it is already embedded in the design of the peace accord. The peace accord says that such a diverse context, society, and territory like Colombia cannot have experienced war the same, and therefore cannot experience peace the same. And so there was this huge discussion during these negotiations about the notion of territorial peace, which is the notion that peace is embedded in the territories, that peace has climate, that it has languages, that it has ethnicity, etc. And so these same principles of intersectionality, these same principles of differentiation they also shaped and informed a lot of the, not just the entities of transitional justice, but many of the entities that were created as part of the Peace Accord, such as the Truth Commission. Particularly in the Truth Commission, you see this in the mandate. As Cécile was saying, the mandate is a triangle, right? Is clarify the past, so looking at the past, in a way that we can prevent war in the future, so you have a future, and that you can contribute to coexistence. So if you say past, present, and future within a very diverse and pluralistic, multicultural society, what the Commission said, therefore, we're embracing dissent, we're embracing those diversity of stories. I think that not having a juridical mandate also softens that approach. I think that if you look at other truth commissions that really had a justice mandate, it's quite different than if you have a truth commission that has a narrative historical mandate. And so the idea was, if you look at the transmedia of the commission, is what is the truth of the ethnic communities? What is the truth of the Afro-Colombian communities? What is the truth of women? So it's all differentiated by mostly positionality, but there was never an idea of even having one final report. If you see, it's 11 volumes, and in those 11 volumes, while you have one volume of findings and recommendations, those findings are basically the summary of all this. But there is not just one single narrative, and that also, perhaps with this, I hand over to my friends and colleagues. That also responds to our current times, the idea that there is an embrace of agonistic peace, of agonistic transitional justice, where the challenge is how do we live in a much more democratic and diverse society, also about stories about who we were during the war and how we can all live in peace today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josefina. So, Aiki, good question on replicability, because this is, what policymakers often want to know. This is great. This is a lovely story. Is it scalable? Is it reproducible somewhere else? Of course, in the peace world, we don't like replicability in the sense that no two cases are exactly the same. So it's not a drag and drop formula. But I do think there's a lot to learn here that other processes can learn from. And part of my evidence for that is this process learned from other processes. And I think in the transitional justice field, there is sort of this epistemic community, a group of people that understand the concepts, that are helping to deliver lessons learned. The International Center on Transitional Justice, particularly, has played a really important role behind the scenes in helping to advise and consult. One of their staff was seconded to the Truth Commission staff even before it got set up during a period where they were planning. And I know in my training in Philadelphia for being an interviewer, they had people from the Minnesota Center on Human Rights that had been the ones in Liberia doing those interviews, the only other case there had been, and we were learning from them. And so I absolutely think there will be not an exportation of the same model, but learning the lessons and normalizing it, that this is something that truth commissions should include and would benefit from including. Cécile, do you want to take the shifting from victim to agency and that one? Or if you don't remember it, I can...
No, that's fine.
Okay.
No, but I also wanted to jump in on replicability, because I completely agree with what you said. But I think what we do in the concluding chapter of our book is actually drawing lessons learned that can be applied by future transitional mechanisms. And we really think that some of these lessons can be applicable not only to Truth Commission, but other types of transitional mechanisms. And actually, it's not only the Truth Commission that worked with Exile in the Colombian case, but also what Josefina mentioned, the REP and the Unidad de Búsqueda, like the two other pillars of the transitional justice system in Colombia. And they've also learned from the experience of the Truth Commission, because perhaps it was like the most advanced at the time. So I just wanted to mention this. About victims exerting growing agency, I think this was a process. It definitely happened for some before the work of the Truth Commission, but as I said, during the work of the Truth Commission, some of these exiles actually took testimonies. they were part of the notes, like the teams that made the decision, because the notes, they were really like the one in charge of implementing the mandates in the different territories. Obviously, they received guidelines from headquarters because there had to be obviously some guidelines to carry out these mandates, but they were the one actually making the decisions on the ground. So some of these exiles were part of the teams. In some countries, they were even making up most of the team of the Truth Commission. I think that was the case, for example, in your note, Jeff, where exiles represented most of the team.
That's
In my note, it was not the case because we had different sectors represented in the note, like academia, like organizations supporting migrants. We also had people from exiles organization, but by participating in all this work, actually, these people also got empowered, and we can really see how they have assumed greater and greater responsibilities over time. Sometimes, for example, in Ecuador, especially because of security issues, they were having like a very low profile at the beginning because they were afraid. People, for example, had never told what had happened to themselves before. But when they succeeded, for example, in telling this, then afterwards they actually were sharing their stories even publicly. For example, during these recognition events that we mentioned, some of them actually agreed to share their story with a very large audience because these recognition events were broadcast on television, on Colombian television, and had like a very, very large audience. So it was like a process. And we can see that during it's even more. People seem to have actually even went to it's another phase in the term of their work. The organizations have become more consolidated, like Exile organization, and they're actually, lots of them are becoming vocal. They're making proposals, for example, to the Colombian parliament, so that exile is recognized as a human rights violation and so on. So it's been like a process.
Cécile, and if I may add to that, I think that the label and the identity of victims, because in Colombia it's a legal category. If you fulfill certain conditions, you're recognized as a victim, and that recognition is a recognition that the state gives you, and therefore you have certain rights. So I would try to contextualize this assumption that being a victim is being devoid of agency, because they're incredibly powerful and they come in all shapes and colors, political alliances, affinities. And this is part of when we were showing those proposals at the beginning that I said, this is the Roy's book. The title of the book is Victims as Peacemakers. So I would just kind of like challenge that within this discursive realm, victimization, of course, is harmful and is painful, but it's also a place of speaking from in that sense.
And perhaps another important thing that we forgot to say, but for example, a lot exiles in Europe were actually leaders back in Colombia. There were civil society leaders, some were even lawyers, judges, especially in Europe. I mean, the kind of profile of exiles in Europe was very much of a very educated leader type, even like leaders from political parties, for example, from Union Patriotica, who had gone into exile in Europe. So you already had that kind of leadership there. But for example, in places like Ecuador, Venezuela, there were this leadership actually emerged later, so to speak, as part of the process. So there are different cases. In some cases, I mean, the leadership came from before, and in some other cases, you know, it was a process. But definitely what we could see is that people who had recently arrived into exile, they usually didn't play so much of a role. The people who played a greater role and exerting more of their agency were people who had kind of overcome also the whole psychosocial consequences like the trauma that exile entails. So they were very often people who had gone into exile like 10 years ago or even more.
So I just want to end by briefly addressing your last question, Maka, about disinformation. And I think this is something that speaks to the resilience of this kind of structure. There absolutely was. Actually, it started before the Truth Commission came into power because the plebiscite to approve or not the peace agreement was subject to relentless disinformation. I mean, here I'm speaking maybe from a political standpoint that uh, Uribe and his allies were not in favor of the peace agreement and mobilized arguments that weren't always very truthful to try to sabotage it. And were successful, actually. The first plebiscite was not approved. So, and even within the Truth Commission, a significant part of its mandate fell within the administration of Duque, Ivan Duque, who is a protege of Uribe, sort of a right-wing figure who was not a fan of the peace process. And it's a testament to the legitimacy of the whole thing and its embeddedness and people's hunger for closure and peace that despite him not necessarily investing as much as the Truth Commission should have been and not being as allied politically, he didn't destroy it. It kept going. And, so some of the disinformation that was mobilized ultimately wasn't so successful. So I think thank you all for being here today and for giving us a space to share this. I mean, you can tell because we can't stop talking about it that we're all passionate about this and think that this work has it's not just a book on the shelf. It has a role to teach other processes of the good stuff that Colombia did. And we're hoping that that will result in better transitional justice and peace processes around the world. So, stay tuned as this comes out, and thank you for your engagement today. And thank you to my colleagues for joining us here at UMass Boston and showing us, what good collaborators we have.
Thank you to all three of you. This has been really wonderful.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.